The morning began as usual for Dana Brooks, but to her, every start held a small but profound ritual. Her alarm buzzed sharply in the pre-dawn silence, vibrating persistently on her nightstand. She opened her eyes slowly, the remnants of a vivid dream still clouding her thoughts. Dana reached out, silencing the alarm, and sat up, stretching and rolling her shoulders, each movement familiar. Each click and ache a reminder of countless early flights. Outside her window, Los Angeles was still dark, the streets lit only by the distant glow of street lamps and the scattered lights from nearby buildings. For a moment, she simply sat there, absorbing the silence. Dana's small apartment was quiet, her own fortress of solitude, meticulously kept, with little else in her bedroom but her flight bag, uniform, and a well-used copy of her father's flight manual from his days in the Navy. She kept it nearby for luck and motivation, a grounding force amidst the high-stakes world she navigated daily. Standing, she walked into the bathroom, where the light flickered on automatically, casting a gentle glow over her reflection. Her face was calm, as always, her brown eyes sharp and focused. Yet Dana could see the subtle signs of exhaustion beneath them, the toll of years spent in a career she had fought tooth and nail to secure. She washed her face, savoring the cool splash of water against her skin, a small ritual she used to shake off any lingering doubts. As she looked into the mirror, she tied her dark, curly hair into a tight bun. It was a familiar act, a way of ensuring she looked the part, embodying every bit of her role as a captain. Today felt different, though. A faint unease simmered in her chest, one she couldn't quite name. Could have been the storm predicted over the Midwest, or maybe just the weight of yet another day in a world that, despite her expertise, always seemed to demand she prove herself once again. Dana reminded herself that she had risen above these challenges before. Today would be no different, she thought. Back in her room, she slipped into her crisp navy blue pilot's uniform. She had carefully ironed it the night before, ensuring every crease fell perfectly across her shoulders and down her legs. Adjusting her sleeves, she took a moment to look at herself in the mirror. For most, the uniform might have been just a work requirement, but for Dana, it was her armor. It was proof of her journey and her resilience. It was validation, a testament to the late nights, the early mornings, and the countless hours spent in flight school, where every test had felt like a hurdle she needed to jump twice as high to clear. On her dresser lay her silver wings, and she picked them up, holding them for a second before pinning them to her chest just above her heart. They had weight, these wings, and they represented more than just her role as a pilot. They were the symbol of her identity, her journey, and everything she'd fought to achieve. Every time she put them on, she felt a mixture of pride and defiance, a reminder to herself and to anyone who doubted her that she belonged in that cockpit. Just then, her phone buzzed with a message. It was Eric, her co-pilot and one of her few close friends. Always punctual, he texted to let her know he was already at the airport. Dana smiled, responding with a quick "on my way." It was an inside joke between them. Eric, the early bird, always at the gate before her. They worked well together, and he had never questioned her ability. But he didn't need to. The world was more than willing to remind her as Dana reached for her bag and keys. Her eyes fell on the mantel where her family photo rested, a moment captured from the day she graduated from flight school. Her parents were there, standing beside her in her first uniform, their faces glowing with pride. She could remember the joy and relief in their eyes, her father's hand firm on her shoulder. He had been her biggest inspiration, a retired Navy pilot who taught her that no barrier was too great. And her mother, who had instilled in her an ironclad resilience, reminded her that she should never let anyone question her right to dream and to achieve, no matter the odds stacked against her. Leaving the apartment, Dana stepped into the crisp morning air, locking the door behind her. The city was still, an empty silence before dawn, with only a few cars on the road. As she drove towards LAX, the streets unfolding before her, her mind wandered back to her earliest memories of flying. Her father had taken her to air shows, lifting her onto his shoulders so she could get a better view of the planes soaring overhead. Those moments had planted the dream in her heart, but it was her own grit and determination that had kept it alive. The drive to the airport was muscle memory by now, each turn and merge as familiar as the cockpit's controls. Yet, as she approached the looming structure of LAX, Dana felt a surge of anticipation, a thrill that always came before a flight. Flying was in her blood, and the excitement of taking to the skies never dulled. She parked her car, grabbed her bag, and walked through the employee entrance, moving through the bustling airport with a practiced ease. The terminal was a blend of hurried passengers, rolling suitcases, and the ambient noise of the early morning crowd. She received the usual stares, some polite, others more curious, and occasionally there was a lingering gaze that made her tighten her jaw. Her uniform often drew attention. Seeing a black female pilot wasn't common, and Dana was aware of the silent judgments that sometimes accompanied those glances. But she'd long since learned to carry herself with quiet dignity, brushing off the stares and focusing solely on her job. As she passed through security, Dana's mind shifted into work mode. She mentally ticked through her pre-flight checklist, going over weather conditions, fuel levels, emergency procedures, and all the other details that would ensure her passengers' safety. She took her responsibilities seriously. Every life on that plane depended on her vigilance, skill, and calm under pressure. Arriving at the gate, she looked out at the plane waiting on the tarmac, its sleek body gleaming under the airport lights. A surge of pride filled her. It never got old, seeing the massive aircraft she was trusted to command. She had worked her entire life for this, defying every stereotype and breaking every barrier to make her place in that cockpit. But as she approached the gate, something caught her attention. Sitting in the waiting area, a woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and an expensive coat watched her with an expression of thinly veiled disdain. She appeared to be in her mid-50s, her face carefully made up, and her eyes held a glint of disapproval. Dana felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach, but kept her face calm and expression neutral. She was used to such looks, though they still stung as Dana walked past. She heard the woman mutter to herself, "Are you kidding me?" The words were barely audible but unmistakably directed at her. Dana's steps faltered for just a split second, a flash of irritation sparking in her chest. It wasn't the first time she'd heard comments like that. Some passengers, people like this woman, couldn't seem to wrap their minds around a black woman being a pilot, suppressing the familiar frustration. Dana continued toward the gate, her gaze steady. She focused on her pre-flight checks, making herself immune to the judgment that seemed to follow her. In her world, proving herself wasn't a one-time event. It was a constant, never-ending process as Dana settled into the rhythm of her pre-flight routine. She took one last deep breath, grounding herself. She had no time for prejudice or doubt. Today, like every other day, she was ready to soar above it. Her life, her work, and her dedication were her response to every doubter, every skeptic, every gaze that questioned her place in the cockpit. Today, as always, Dana Brooks would prove, if not to them, then to herself, that she belonged. Dana's routine was momentarily interrupted by a loud, entitled voice cutting through the usual hum of airport activity. She turned slightly to see the same woman from before, her face twisted in open disdain, her gaze directed squarely at, "Excuse me," the woman called out, her voice carrying a note of incredulous annoyance. "You mean to tell me you're the pilot for this flight?" The question hung in the air, loud enough to attract the attention of several other passengers. Dana steadied herself, her eyes locking with the woman's as she maintained her professional composure. "Yes, ma'am," Dana replied, her tone polite but firm. "I'm the captain for—" The woman's face contorted, her disbelief barely contained. "Well, I just don't feel comfortable," she said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "With someone like you in charge." Dana felt a jolt of anger but buried it beneath years of practiced self-control. She kept her expression neutral, her gaze steady as she faced down the woman's thinly veiled hostility. It wasn't the first time she had dealt with such prejudice, and unfortunately, she doubted it would be the last. "I assure you, ma'am," Dana said calmly, "I am fully qualified to fly this aircraft and ensure your safety." The woman scoffed, her sneer deepening. "I want to speak to the real pilot," she said, her gaze shifting over Dana's shoulder as if someone else might magically appear to take her place. Dana's hand tightened on the edge of her tablet. The woman's words were insulting, laced with assumptions that Dana was all too familiar with. But just as she was about to respond, her co-pilot, Eric, peered beside her, his presence a steadying force. "Is there a problem here?" Eric's voice was cool and composed, his blue eyes taking in the situation with a quick, assessing glance. The woman's expression softened, as if she believed her savior had finally arrived. She looked at Eric with an expectant smile. "Yes, I was just telling her," she gestured dismissively toward Dana. That I don't feel comfortable flying with her as the captain. Eric's jaw tightened, a glint of restrained anger flickering in his eyes. Ma'am, he said, his voice steady but firm. Captain Brooks is one of the most skilled pilots I've ever had the pleasure of flying with. If you have any concerns, I suggest you reconsider them. The woman's face flushed with embarrassment, her attempt to garner support from Eric thwarted. She opened her mouth to argue further but seemed to think better of it, huffing and crossing her arms before finally storming onto the plane. Dana watched her go, a mix of irritation and resignation simmering beneath her calm exterior. She had faced worse, but each encounter left its mark, a reminder of the unrelenting biases she had to overcome daily. Thank you, Dana said quietly to Eric, her voice barely a whisper. Eric shrugged, a small, supportive smile touching his lips. You shouldn't have to deal with that kind of nonsense, he replied. People like her don't get it. Dana nodded, though the sting of the woman's words still lingered. No matter how many flights she completed, no matter how many lives she kept safe, there would always be people like her, people who couldn't look beyond her skin color or her gender. It never got easier, but she had learned to steel herself, to let the hurt run off her like rain. Today would be no different. They proceeded onto the plane, the familiar sights and sounds of the cockpit calming Dana's mind. She took her seat, settling into the routine that had become second nature. The cockpit was her domain, a world of precision and focus where the prejudices of the outside world fell away, replaced by the steady hum of the controls and the complex beauty of flight. As Dana and Eric went through the pre-flight checklist, she allowed herself to relax into the rhythm of their routine. Her hands moved confidently over the controls, her mind absorbing every detail and parameter. This was where she belonged. Here, in the heart of the aircraft, she was in control, free from the doubts that tried to cling to her like shadows. She glanced at Eric, who was focused on the instruments, his face relaxed but attentive. He had become a trusted friend over the years, and though they rarely spoke about the challenges she faced, Dana knew he understood. She was grateful for that unspoken support. "Engines good?" he asked, his voice breaking the quiet focus of the cockpit. "All clear," she replied, her voice steady. They moved seamlessly through the last of their checks, and as the final boarding call went out, Dana turned her attention to the passengers settling into their seats. She spotted Megan Rivera, the head flight attendant, moving up and down the aisles, her bright smile a welcome presence. Megan had a knack for putting passengers at ease, and Dana admired her for it. "You ready for another adventure, Captain?" Megan asked as she popped her head into the cockpit, her tone light-hearted. Dana managed a small smile, grateful for the familiar levity Megan brought. "Always," she replied, the earlier tension in her voice finally easing. The boarding process completed, Dana and Eric prepared for takeoff. As Dana announced the flight details to the passengers, She couldn't help but wonder if the woman from earlier was still glaring at her from her first-class seat. The thought was sobering, but Dana pushed it aside. She had a flight to command, and she wouldn't let one person's prejudice undermine her focus. "Let's get this bird in the air," Eric said, glancing at her with a supportive nod. Dana gripped the controls, feeling the familiar rush of anticipation that always came before takeoff. She pushed the throttle forward, the plane roaring to life as it sped down the runway. The thrill of lifting off, the moment when the plane broke free from the earth and soared into the sky, was pure magic to Dana. It was the reason she had fought so hard to be here. The freedom of flight, an unyielding reminder of her place in the world. As they climbed higher, Los Angeles became a patchwork of lights beneath them, fading as they pierced through the clouds. Dana exhaled, her shoulders relaxing as they reached cruising altitude. The steady hum of the engines filled the cockpit, and for a moment, Dana allowed herself to bask in the peace of the open sky. Yet, as she glanced at the radar, a frown creased her brow. A storm was forming over the Midwest, moving faster than expected. Dana's mind shifted into problem-solving mode, analyzing the data and calculating the potential for turbulence. She would need to keep a close eye on it. But for now, all systems were stable. Behind her, the passengers were settling in for the long flight. Dana knew most of them would be asleep within the hour, lulled by the gentle sway of the plane and the comfort of the journey. But one passenger, she was certain, would be keeping a watchful eye on her, no doubt fueled by her own misplaced fears. "Looks like we might have some turbulence up ahead," Eric commented, his gaze flicking to the radar. Dana nodded, her hands steady on the controls. "I'll adjust our course if needed. Nothing we can't handle." Eric offered her a reassuring smile. "We've got this." Dana appreciated his confidence, though a part of her couldn't shake the lingering unease. She had flown through storms before, but something about today's encounter with the passenger had unsettled her more deeply than usual. It was as if the woman's words had opened a wound she had long since healed, bringing old insecurities to the surface. She took a steadying breath, refocusing her mind. Up here, she was in control. Up here, she was free. The early minutes of the flight from Los Angeles to New York were smooth, the plane cruising through clear skies as dawn began to break over the horizon. Dana sat back in the captain's seat, her hands resting lightly on the controls, a sense of calm settling over her. But even as she allowed herself a moment of relief, a part of her remained alert, her mind still processing the interaction with the passenger at the gate. Her hands tightened on the yoke as her thoughts drifted back to that moment, the woman's dismissive sneer and cold tone lingering in Dana's memory. It was a reaction she'd encountered before, an open doubt in her abilities simply because of her appearance, her skin color, her gender. The things she could not change yet had fought all her life to turn into symbols of her resilience, had once again been weaponized against her. The familiarity of the cockpit offered a brief reprieve. Here, surrounded by dials, switches, and the steady hum of the engines. She was where she belonged. The cockpit was a place of order, where everything made sense, every control and procedure in place to ensure the safety of the flight. Yet, Dana felt the weight of that woman's distrust bearing down on her like an invisible force. "Doing okay, Captain?" Eric's voice brought her back to the present, his gaze meeting hers with quiet concern. He knew her well enough to sense when something was off. Dana forced a smile, nodding. "Just thinking." "Thinking or overthinking?" he teased gently, a smile tugging at his lips. "Because I think we both know you've got nothing to prove." She appreciated his words, but they did little to soothe the frustration that had taken root inside her. "Sometimes I wonder if anything I do will ever be enough for people like her," she admitted softly, her voice carrying a hint of exhaustion. Eric's expression grew serious. "It's not about them," he said, his voice steady. "You're here because you've earned it, because you're damn good at what you do. Don't let one person's ignorance make you doubt that." Dana nodded, knowing he was right, but it was difficult to shake the feeling of having to prove herself again and again. She had spent years working her way up the ranks, facing skepticism at every turn. And while she had built a reputation for her skill and composure, the world seemed slow to catch up to her accomplishments. The hum of the engines and the gentle sway of the plane began to calm her, drawing her back to the present. She shifted her focus to the radar, studying the incoming weather pattern with a critical eye. The storm over the Midwest loomed ahead, moving faster than forecasted. She'd need to make some adjustments if they wanted to avoid the roughest patches of turbulence. "Looks like we'll be hitting some weather sooner than expected," she informed Eric, her fingers moving over the controls with practiced ease. Eric leaned in, studying the radar. "Should we adjust our altitude?" Dana nodded. "I think it's our best option. This storm's moving in quicker than they thought. We can ride it out if we adjust now." Eric gave her a reassuring nod. "We're in good hands," he said, his tone light but sincere. Dana allowed herself a small smile, the familiar rhythm of flight taking over her thoughts as they altered their course. It was moments like these, when she was deeply immersed in the precision of her work, that she felt most at peace. Up here, above the clouds, everything seemed simpler. Up here, she was in control. But as they pressed on, the turbulence began to intensify, the plane shuddering under the force of the storm. Dana's hands tightened on the yoke, her mind quickly calculating the safest path forward. She could feel the tension in the air, an electric charge that seemed to seep into the cockpit, reminding her of the immense responsibility she held in her hands. Behind her, she could hear the faint murmur of voices from the cabin. Passengers were beginning to stir, some exchanging nervous glances as the turbulence grew stronger. She knew the head flight attendant, Megan, would be moving through the cabin, offering reassuring smiles and guiding passengers to fasten their seatbelts. Then, over the faint sounds of the intercom, she heard a familiar voice, the same woman from the gate, her tone now sharp with fear. "What's going on?" Why is the plane shaking so much? Dana's jaw clenched, the words piercing through her focus. It was one thing to deal with a storm, another to be reminded of the prejudices that clung to her like shadows. She knew the woman's doubts were not only directed at her skills, but at her very presence in the captain's seat. And now, in the middle of a storm, she felt the weight of that distrust pressing down on her even harder. Eric glanced at her, his brow furrowing as he picked up on her tension. "Ignore her," he said quietly, his tone calm. "You've got this." Dana took a steadying breath, nodding as she refocused on the task at hand. She couldn't afford to let her emotions distract her. Not now. Not with the storm raging around them. Her job was to keep everyone on board safe, to guide them through the turbulence with the skill and precision she had spent years mastering. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Dana's voice came over the intercom, calm and reassuring despite the turmoil around them. "We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence due to a fast-moving storm, but please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We're taking every precaution to ensure a safe flight, and we'll be through this shortly." Her voice carried an authority born of experience, each word measured and steady. But as she set the intercom down, she couldn't help but feel the weight of Susan Caldwell's gaze, the distrust radiating from her seat in first class like an anchor tied to Dana's spirit. She had faced many storms in her career, but this was one she had no control over, a storm of doubt and prejudice that clung to her every move. The turbulence grew stronger, the plane bucking as it struggled against the powerful winds. Dana's mind went into overdrive, her focus sharp as she navigated through the storm. This was what she had trained for, the reason she had spent countless hours perfecting her skills. She wouldn't let the doubts of one person undermine her confidence or shake her resolve. But then the plane lurched, a sudden drop sending a wave of fear rippling through the cabin. She could hear gasps and murmurs from the passengers, the tension in the air palpable. Dana's heart raced, her hands moving swiftly over the controls as she fought to stabilize the aircraft. Beside her, Eric's voice cut through the noise. "Let's drop altitude," he suggested, his tone calm but focused. "The winds are stronger up here. We'll have a better chance lower down." Dana nodded, adjusting their course as they descended, her mind a whirlwind of calculations and adjustments. She had done this before, flown through storms far worse than this, but the stakes felt higher now, the doubts of one passenger amplifying the pressure she felt to succeed. With each dip and sway, Dana's grip on the controls tightened, her mind focused entirely on guiding the plane safely through the storm. She couldn't afford to think about Susan Caldwell or her doubts. She couldn't afford to let one person's prejudice shake her confidence. All that mattered was the task at hand, the lives in her care and the responsibility she carried. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the turbulence began to subside. The plane steadied, the winds less fierce as they broke through the edge of the storm. Dana exhaled, her muscles relaxing as the cockpit filled with the calm hum of the engines once more. They had made it through. her skill and composure guiding them safely out of the storm. Beside her, Eric gave a small nod, a gesture of quiet respect. "You handled that like a pro," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. Dana managed a tired smile, the weight of the journey settling over her. "Thanks," she replied softly, though the lingering tension in her chest reminded her that the storm hadn't passed entirely. She had proven herself yet again. But the doubts and prejudices that had clouded the journey still cast a shadow over her sense of accomplishment. As the plane cruised through the calm skies, Dana allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had always known that her journey would be filled with challenges, that each step forward would require her to prove herself in ways others didn't have to. And while she was proud of the strides she had made, the journey still felt lonely at times, the weight of others' doubts a constant burden. But as she looked out at the horizon, the vast expanse of sky stretching before her, she reminded herself of why she had chosen this path. She belonged here, in the captain's seat, guiding others through the storms of life with skill and resilience. And no matter how many times she had to prove herself, she would rise to the challenge, flying higher with each passing storm. As Flight 297 pushed forward, Dana's relief from having passed through the storm was short-lived. The plane's slight jostles signaled that they weren't entirely free of turbulence, but her instincts told her that the worst of the storm was still to come. The Midwest was notorious for rapid weather changes, and from her experience, she knew this could quickly turn into another round of intense turbulence. She braced herself, mentally preparing for whatever the sky had in store. The cockpit was filled with the constant, low hum of the engines and the soft flickering of dials and instruments. Beside her, Eric monitored the radar with a wary eye. He occasionally glanced her way, and his presence was a reassuring reminder that she wasn't alone in this. Together, they had weathered many flights, and he understood her skill and precision without question. Still, in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the lingering weight of Susan Caldwell's judgment. The woman's glare, her cutting words, "Someone like you," seemed to reverberate through her mind, echoing louder in the quiet moments of flight. "What's our next move, Captain?" Eric's voice brought her back to the present. Dana checked the radar, her fingers tapping thoughtfully against the console. She didn't want to descend too quickly. That could make the turbulence worse. Instead, she decided to veer slightly off course to bypass a particularly dense cluster of storm clouds that had begun forming. "We'll adjust a few degrees north to avoid that pocket," she replied, her voice steady and professional. "Let's monitor and keep our altitude for now." Eric nodded, his calm acceptance of her judgment helping her ground herself in the immediate task. She had earned this position through hard work and relentless determination, and he was someone who respected her entirely. But as much as she wanted to stay focused, a part of her mind lingered on the ways her identity had always factored into her career. From the early days of flight school, through every promotion, she had been under a microscope, scrutinized for every decision she made. She knew she couldn't afford to falter, not even slightly, because the doubts she faced would only magnify any perceived mistake. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, causing it to lurch suddenly. Dana's hands tightened around the yoke as she adjusted, the movement second nature to her by now. But she could sense the shift in the cabin behind her. Passengers would be growing anxious, gripping their seats, whispering to one another. Megan, the head flight attendant, would be moving up and down the aisles, reassuring people as best she could. The storm outside, the doubts inside, and her relentless focus on keeping the flight steady all formed a complex weight pressing down on her. As the plane continued through rough skies, she allowed her mind to drift back to her training days. She remembered one of her instructors, Captain Harlan, a man known for his high standards and demanding attitude. He had been one of the few people in her early career who didn't question her abilities. But he had also made it clear that she'd need to be more than perfect. He had told her that her journey would be harder, that people would expect more of her simply because they didn't expect her to be there in the first place. They'll measure you by a different scale, Dana, he had said. But if anyone can rise to that challenge, it's you. Harlan's words had been both a comfort and a curse. They motivated her, but they also reminded her of the limitations she couldn't control, the biases of others, the ever-present shadow of prejudice. Now, as she navigated through another storm, she felt the weight of those words more acutely than ever. The pressure to be flawless, to defy expectations with every single flight, had been the fuel driving her career. But it was also exhausting, a constant reminder that her competence was never simply assumed. Suddenly, Eric's voice cut through her thoughts. Looks like the worst of the storm is to the northeast. If we keep heading in this direction, we'll bypass the worst of it, but it's going to be a rough ride. Dana took a steadying breath, adjusting the controls as she glanced at the radar. The storm was indeed intensifying, the cloud formations swelling into massive, dark masses on the radar screen. But there was something else, a sense of familiarity in the turbulence, an intuition she had honed over the years that told her she was making the right choices. She knew this storm. She had felt it before, if not in the exact shape and size, then in the pulse of her instincts. "We'll stay on this course," she replied, her voice unwavering. "If we maintain altitude, we'll ride it out." Eric gave her a reassuring nod, and the silent trust between them felt like a lifeline. He didn't question her, didn't second-guess her calls. He trusted her, and for that, she was grateful. But as she refocused on the task at hand, the intercom buzzed, interrupting her brief moment of peace. The sound of Susan Caldwell's voice was unmistakable, carrying a note of panic. "Excuse me, can I speak to the pilot?" The edge of her tone suggested more than fear. It was an accusation, a reminder of the underlying prejudice that Dana had come to recognize all too well. Dana's jaw clenched, her hands instinctively gripping the yoke tighter. This woman, so unyielding in her assumptions, had no idea of the challenges Dana had already faced, the storms she had conquered, both in the sky and on the ground. Yet here she was, questioning Dana's competence, as if the turbulence was somehow a reflection of her skill. Eric's gaze flickered toward her, his brow furrowing. "Ignore her, Dana," he said softly, though his voice held a quiet frustration. "You don't owe her anything." Dana nodded, but the woman's words still stung. She knew she couldn't let her emotions cloud her judgment. Not here. Not now. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of Captain Harlan's words, of the countless hours of training and preparation that had brought her to this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Her voice over the intercom was calm and steady, free from the tension that simmered beneath the surface. "We are currently navigating through a storm system, and we ask that you remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. I assure you, we are taking every measure to ensure your safety, and we will be through this shortly." Her tone was professional, controlled, but as she set down the intercom, a wave of frustration washed over her. She knew that no matter how well she handled this flight, there would always be people like Susan Caldwell, people who saw only what they wanted to see, who reduced her to the color of her skin and the fact that she was a woman in a field where she was still an exception. The turbulence intensified, the plane shuddering as it climbed through the dense clouds. Dana's hands moved over the controls with practiced ease, her focus laser-sharp. She was reminded of her father's words, words he had spoken to her when she was just a child dreaming of flying. "The sky belongs to everyone," he had said, "but you have to be bold enough to claim it." And she had claimed it. She had fought for her place in the sky, for every inch of ground she had gained. Yet moments like these made her question whether it was enough, whether it would ever be enough. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the turbulence began to subside, the storm clouds thinning as they broke through to calmer skies. Dana exhaled slowly, a weight lifting from her shoulders as the plane steadied, the hum of the engines settling into a peaceful rhythm. Beside her, Eric offered a small smile, a silent acknowledgement of her skill. "You did it," he said quietly, his words filled with admiration. "Smooth as ever, Captain." Dana managed a faint smile, but the storm had left a mark, a reminder of the challenges she faced both inside and outside the cockpit. She knew that she would continue to encounter people like Susan Caldwell, that she would always be fighting against the doubts and biases that clung to her like shadows. But as she looked out at the endless expanse of sky, she reminded herself of the journey that had brought her here, of the storms she had weathered and the battles she had won. She was a pilot, and this was where she belonged, flying through the clouds, charting a course through the storms, defying the doubts that tried to hold her back. The sky was hers, and she would keep claiming it, one flight at a time, as Flight 297 soared into the serene aftermath of the storm. Dana Brooks allowed herself a moment of quiet, steadying her breath as she felt the plane relax beneath her hands. Her gaze moved over the vast sky beyond the cockpit window, the soft light of dawn beginning to edge over the horizon. The hum of the engines blended into the calm around her. But Dana's mind was far from quiet. The storm had passed, but the tension hadn't. Eric sat beside her, his focus on the instruments, but Dana could sense his lingering frustration from earlier. The way he had wanted to respond to Susan Caldwell's outburst. His support was a small solace against the flood of emotions she was trying to hold back. Being in control of this plane meant being in control of herself. But each comment from passengers like Susan left bruises that were becoming harder to ignore. "You okay?" Eric asked, finally breaking the silence between them. His voice was calm but probing, and Dana could feel his gaze on her even as she cooed. She nodded, exhaling slowly. "I'm fine. Just another day, right?" "Not just any day," he replied gently. "It takes a lot to handle someone like her. I don't know if I could have kept as calm as you did back there." Dana allowed herself a small, wry smile. "I've had practice. Too much. Maybe." He gave a knowing nod, a quiet acknowledgement of the unspoken realities she faced in her career. But he didn't pry further, sensing that this was something Dana preferred to keep close, guarded. She appreciated that about him. He never forced her to share more than she was ready to. Her mind wandered back to her journey, the years spent proving herself over and over, each success accompanied by questions from strangers, each promotion by skeptical glances from colleagues. She had learned to shoulder these doubts, to use them as fuel for her ambitions. Yet today, the weight of them felt heavier, a reminder of how far she had come and how far she still had to go. After a pause, Eric added, "For what it's worth, you're the best I've ever flown with, Dana. Doesn't matter what anyone else says." His words hung in the air, a balm against the stings of the morning. But she knew better than to let herself relax into them. Eric's belief in her was unwavering, but she had learned over time that this wasn't always the case with others. There would always be new Susans, new voices questioning her worth. A quiet buzz from the cabin intercom pulled Dana from her thoughts. It was Megan, the head flight attendant. "Captain Brooks, everything's settled back here. Passengers are calmer now, and we're preparing for breakfast service. Just wanted to check in." Dana could hear the subtle reassurance in Megan's voice, her support carefully conveyed in those few words. She tapped the intercom button, replying in a steady tone. "Thank you, Megan. Let me know if there's anything else you need." As she released the button, a soft knock on the cockpit door followed. Megan stepped in, her face calm but her eyes searching, catching Dana's gaze. "Everything all right, Captain?" Dana nodded, offering a reassuring smile. "All under control, Megan. Thank you." Megan nodded back, but Dana knew Megan could read her better than most. After working together on countless flights, they had formed a bond, a quiet understanding that didn't need to be put into words. "She's still watching you, you know," Megan murmured, her voice just loud enough for Dana and Eric to hear. "Susan, I think she's expecting something to go wrong." Dana's smile tightened, but she kept her voice light. "Well, she'll just have to be disappointed." With a quick nod, Megan left the cockpit, closing the door softly behind her. The reminder that Susan Caldwell was still harboring doubts added a fresh wave of irritation, and Dana took a steadying breath, centering herself. Letting Susan's suspicions get to her now would only serve to give them power. Eric looked over at her again, an understanding look in his eyes. People like her, they'll always find something to question, he said, as if reading her mind. She nodded slowly. I know, but it gets tiring, you know? Always having to prove myself, even when there's nothing left to prove. Eric's gaze softened. You're not just proving yourself, Dana. You're setting a new standard, making way for others who will come after you. They may not see it now, but you're changing what's possible. Dana absorbed his words, letting the comfort of them wash over her. She knew he was right, but the fatigue from the constant vigilance had built up over time. A subtle erosion of her once unshakable determination. She had entered this profession with unbreakable optimism, her eyes focused on the skies, determined to fly, but the years had tempered that optimism, turning it into resilience, a harder, more enduring drive. She leaned back slightly in her seat, her hands still steady on the controls as she cast a look over the radar. Clear skies lay ahead now, and the tension from the turbulence began to ease, if only slightly. As the hours passed, Dana found herself settling into the rhythm of the flight, allowing the calm to soothe her nerves. The plane glided smoothly over the clouds, and the golden light from the sunrise spilled into the cockpit, bathing her in a warm glow. This was the part of flying she loved most, the quiet moments, the feeling of boundless freedom, the reminder that she was part of something bigger than herself. The intercom buzzed again, and Megan's voice filled the cockpit. Captain, I just wanted to let you know that we're all set for landing procedures. Passengers are seated, and the cabin is secure. Thank you, Megan, Dana replied, a sense of relief filling her. The end of the flight was in sight, and with it, the hope of leaving this experience behind. As they began their descent toward New York, Dana's thoughts returned to the day's events. She felt the weight of Susan Caldwell's judgment slowly begin to fade, replaced by a renewed resolve. Susan might never see her as competent, might never recognize the skills that Dana had honed over years of relentless training and dedication. But Dana realized she didn't need her validation. She had faced doubts like Susan's before, and she knew she would again. What mattered was that she knew her own worth. Eric caught her eye, giving her a nod as he adjusted his own controls. Readying for the landing, they worked in sync, each move precise, familiar, a testament to their shared professionalism and mutual respect. As they touched down, the wheels skimming smoothly over the runway, a sense of triumph filled Dana. She had flown through yet another storm, both literal and metaphorical, and she had emerged stronger on the other side. Her journey as a pilot had always been about more than just the act of flying. It was about breaking boundaries, defying expectations, and paving the way for those who would come after her. With the plane taxiing to the gate, Dana felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that her fight wasn't just for herself, but for every person who would one day dream of flying. And as she prepared to face her passengers, she promised herself that she would keep pushing forward, no matter how many storms she had to face. As the passengers disembarked, Dana caught sight of Susan Caldwell. The woman hesitated for a brief moment, her gaze catching Dana's, a hint of something unspoken lingering in her expression. For the first time, Dana thought she saw a flicker of acknowledgement, perhaps even a trace of respect. Susan gave a tight nod, almost reluctant, before she continued down the aisle and disappeared from sight. Dana watched her go, feeling a strange sense of closure. She had flown the plane, faced the storm, and stood her ground in the face of prejudice. And as the last passenger left, Dana stood tall, knowing she had done exactly what she was meant to do. She was a pilot, and the sky was hers to conquer. After the flight, Dana walked through the terminal toward the crew lounge. The familiar hum of the airport was strangely calming after the tension of the morning, a comforting noise she'd come to rely on as a steady reminder of where she belonged. Yet, even as she stepped into the familiar space of the crew lounge, her mind lingered on the flight she'd just completed and the simmering tension that Susan Caldwell had left behind. Eric joined her moments later, a reassuring presence as he settled into a seat beside her. He offered her a gentle smile, but his eyes held a question, a silent invitation for her to share what was weighing on her mind. "You did everything right up there," he said quietly, breaking the silence between them. His voice was full of a quiet conviction, like he'd anticipated her doubts and wanted to intercept them before they could settle in. Dana forced a small smile, taking a long, slow breath. "I know," she replied, though her voice was soft, nearly swallowed by the noise around them. "It's not that, or maybe it is. I don't know." Eric gave her an understanding nod, encouraging her to go on. "It's the relentlessness of it all," she finally admitted, her eyes fixed on the coffee in her hands. "Every flight feels like a test. Every day I'm reminded of how hard I had to fight just to be here. And every day I wonder if it's ever going to be enough." Eric shifted in his seat, his gaze steady and unyielding. "You've broken through more barriers than most people could even imagine," he said, "and you do it with such grace. But I get it, it's exhausting, always having to prove yourself." Dana nodded, grateful for his words but still feeling the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. She thought back to her earliest days in flight school, to the wide-eyed young woman she had been, eager and hopeful, driven by the belief that she could conquer the skies. But she hadn't known then what the journey would truly demand of her, how it would test her resolve in ways she had never anticipated. "I used to think," she said softly, more to herself than to Eric, "that as long as I worked hard, as long as I kept my head down and proved my competence, people would see me as I am, a pilot, just like anyone else." Eric's gaze grew thoughtful, and he leaned back slightly, giving her space to continue. "But no matter how many flights I've taken, no matter how many storms I've navigated, There are always people like Susan Caldwell, people who see something else first and who don't bother to look beyond it. Her voice wavered for a moment before she steadied it. Sometimes I wonder if it will ever really change. Eric sighed, a look of quiet empathy crossing his face. I don't know if it'll change as fast as it should, but I do know this: you're making a difference. Dana, just by being here, you're challenging everything they thought they knew. A flicker of warmth touched her heart, a small comfort against the doubts that gnawed at her. She wanted to believe him, wanted to feel like her journey was more than just a series of battles fought and one with no lasting impact. But today, it felt harder than usual to hold on to that belief. Taking a deep breath, she tried to shake off the frustration lingering from her encounter with Susan Caldwell. The woman had only been a brief presence on her flight, but her words had cut deeply. Each dismissive remark a reminder of the prejudice Dana faced daily. She felt the wounds reopening, her resolve tested once more. But she reminded herself that she had weathered far worse. And yet, each new doubt planted by others chipped away at her, like an unending erosion. As Dana stared into her coffee, she could almost hear her father's voice, calm and steady, echoing from the past. He had been her first inspiration, her unwavering support, his pride in her achievements a steadfast beacon through every dark moment she'd faced. The sky belongs to everyone, Dana, he used to say, but only those who are willing to push through the storms get to call it home. With a sudden clarity, Dana realized how true those words were. She had chosen this path, chosen to fight against the odds, to rise above the assumptions and prejudices that sought to hold her back. And despite the challenges, despite the exhaustion, she still loved flying, still felt that undeniable connection to the skies that had drawn her in as a child. I don't know if it'll ever get easier, she said finally, her voice a little stronger. But I know it's worth it. Eric nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You're right, and you're not alone in this. You've got a lot of people who believe in you. Dana, she looked up at him, her own smile breaking through the heaviness of her thoughts. Thanks, Eric. Really. They sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their thoughts. Dana let herself savor the moment, feeling a small but genuine sense of relief settle over her. She wasn't one to dwell on these moments of doubt for long. She had learned over time how to pick herself up and keep moving forward. But she also knew that admitting her struggles didn't make her any less resilient. In fact, it made her stronger, a reminder that her journey was one of resilience, of choosing to fight each day for the dreams she held close. Just as Dana was about to get up, her phone buzzed with a message. She checked the screen, her eyebrows lifting in surprise as she read the unfamiliar number and the brief note it contained. Captain Brooks, I wanted to apologize for my behavior on the flight today. I was wrong, and I can see that now. Thank you for getting us to our destination safely. Sincerely, Susan Caldwell. Dana stared at the message, her mind reeling. She hadn't expected this. A note of apology from someone like Susan, whose doubts had seemed so unshakable. For a moment, she felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief and quiet validation that her presence, her skill, had finally pierced through someone's prejudice. Eric noticed her expression, tilting his head with a curious smile. "Good news." She looked up, her voice softer, almost disbelieving. "It's from Susan. She apologized." Eric's eyes widened, a grin spreading across his face. "Well, looks like you did more than just fly her across the country. You changed her mind." Dana chuckled, feeling a lightness she hadn't felt all day. "I guess so." As she tucked her phone away, Dana felt a renewed sense of purpose ignite within her. Maybe things wouldn't change overnight, and maybe she would always face challenges like today. But if she could shift even one person's perspective, if she could break through even one wall of doubt, then her journey was worth it. The weight she carried wasn't just hers. It was shared by all those who would come after her, those who dreamed of the skies but feared the barriers they'd face along the way. Standing, she looked down at Eric, offering him a grateful smile. "Thanks for being here, Eric. It means a lot." "Anytime, Captain," he replied, giving her a nod of respect. "You keep doing what you're doing. The world needs more pilots like you." With a final nod, Dana headed for the door, her steps steady and her heart full. She knew her path wouldn't always be easy, but she felt a renewed strength guiding her forward. Her journey was far from over, and there would always be new storms to face. But with every flight, every barrier she broke, she was carving a path not just for herself, but for others who would follow. As she stepped back into the bustling airport terminal, Dana felt her spirit lift, her vision clear. The sky was waiting, vast and boundless, ready for her to claim it once again. Dana sat in her car, the airport lights glowing softly in the rearview mirror as she looked out over the darkened runway. She'd spent the last few hours in the air, navigating a turbulent cross-country flight, a task that had, over the years, become as familiar to her as breathing. But tonight, her thoughts lingered more on the journey that had led her here, to this very moment. A message had come through as she'd landed. Her promotion to the airline's senior training team was official. She would soon be guiding new pilots, helping them navigate not just the skies but the world of pressures, challenges, and expectations that came with the job. The thought stirred a complex mixture of emotions within her: pride, relief, and a familiar ache that carried the weight of every barrier she'd had to overcome. This was a hard-earned victory, not just for herself but for those who had come before and those who would come after her. Her phone buzzed beside her, and she saw the congratulatory messages from Eric, Megan, her parents, people who had stood by her, reminding her of her worth on days when doubt had nearly overwhelmed her. But Dana knew that her journey, her dream of becoming a pilot, had always been her own. In the end, it was a journey only she could truly understand. She thought back to her first days in flight school, the feeling of awe mixed with a sense of intimidation as she'd realized the scale of what she was up against. The expectations of those who doubted her hung over her head. And yet, as she had watched other planes soar into the sky, she'd felt her resolve grow stronger. Tonight, that feeling was different. It was quieter, tempered by years of experience and resilience. She had fought her way through a world that had tried to exclude her, a world that had forced her to work twice as hard for half the recognition. But now, as she prepared to take on this new role, she felt a shift, a sense that her fight had yielded more than personal achievement. It had paved the way for others to find their own wings. Her thoughts drifted to Susan Caldwell, who, months earlier, had surprised her with a heartfelt apology. The memory still lingered, reminding Dana that even small gestures of change mattered. She'd received similar messages from other passengers over time, small acknowledgments that chipped away at the prejudices they'd held. Some people, she realized, could change, and while their transformation wouldn't erase the challenges she'd faced, it brought her a quiet satisfaction, knowing that her persistence had made an impact. Dana glanced at the stars above, the night sky vast and open, like the future that awaited her. This promotion was not just a recognition of her skills, but a chance to guide others, to help them navigate both the technicalities of flying and the silent battles they might face within the industry. She knew that many young pilots, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds, would look to her for guidance. She would show them, as her father had once told her, that the sky belonged to everyone who dared to claim it. The realization filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. Dana knew there would still be challenges, those didn't disappear overnight, but she was ready to face them. And more than that, she was ready to help others face their own. She would teach them that resilience wasn't about shutting out the world's doubts, but rather finding the courage to rise above them. She'd show them how to carry both strength and grace, to hold onto their dreams even when the world tried to make them let go. As the terminal lights dimmed, Dana reached for her keys, feeling a sense of closure. This chapter of her life was ending, but her journey was far from over. She was stepping into a new role, a new responsibility, but with each step, she carried the lessons, the battles, and the victories that had defined her. Starting the engine, she glanced once more at the runway, a feeling of peace settling over her. She was not just a pilot but a pathfinder, guiding others toward a future where they could soar without limits. And as she drove away from the airport, Dana knew that, no matter where the journey led her next, she was finally free to embrace it fully, knowing she had earned every inch of sky that stretched before her.